more tonight is colliding with the Supreme Court over whether to let states ban gender-affirming care for kids and teens. That's a case in front of the justices here with, it seems, the signal so far that they will, in fact, show support for letting states restrict gender-affirming care for trans youth. At issue here is a Tennessee law that essentially looks to ban hormone surgery, restrict puberty blockers for trans kids and teens. That has put transgender care back at the center of the political conversation. And depending how the court rules, this could have an impact well beyond the state of Tennessee. You see it there. More than 20 other states have similar restrictions or bans in place. This is a story that I was covering just a little bit ago, actually. I went outside the court where you can see some of these huge crowds that have gathered here. Some of them hoping to, as you see on the sign, protect trans youth, other who don't believe in the validity of gender-affirming care. I spoke with one teenager, Atlas, and his mom, Courtney, asking what is his message for the court as they potentially move now, to strip rights from trans youth. Atlas, what would you want the justices to know about you if you could give them a message?
I'm human. I'm just the same as any other kid, other than the fact that I identify differently. You know, just because I'm trans doesn't mean I don't go to sleepovers. I don't play video games. I don't mess with my siblings. You know, I'm a human kid. I feel things the same way as other kids do.
I want to bring in our Supreme Court reporter, Lawrence Hurley, who is following this for us. Thanks for being here, Lawrence. So it really came down to this, right? The Biden administration argued that this law discriminates on the basis of sex because while it restricted some of these procedures for trans youth, it allowed those treatments in other instances unrelated to gender-affirming care. And they said, wait a second, can't do that. What you heard from some conservatives was like, hey, we don't think we should step in where states are making these decisions. And by the way, some of these justices pointed to countries in Europe that have started to put new restrictions on this kind of care. Walk us through what seemed to be the defining point for some of the conservative members of the majority who look poised now to uphold this Tennessee law.
Yeah, I mean, the key legal issue here is whether you actually see it as being sex discrimination or even a classification based on sex, which would then implicate the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And it seemed clear that the conservative justices don't see it that way, and they see it as being an issue of medical uncertainty, and that's something that they should just defer to states on because they're better placed to the legislatures to kind of deal with that. That's something that Chief Justice John Roberts said, for example, whereas the liberal justices like Justice Sonia Sotomayor are much more skeptical of that, and they're like, this is a vulnerable minority group, and you can't rely on democracy to protect them. And I think we can hear a little bit of audio about what they said.
My understanding is that the Constitution leaves that question to the people's representatives rather than to 9 people, none of whom is a doctor.
When you're 1% of the population or less, very hard to see how the democratic process is going to protect you.
And so you can see, you know, there's a real divide there among the liberal and conservative justices on this. And of course, the liberal justices, there's only 3 of them.
Just going to say, remind people that the liberal justices are outnumbered here, right?
There's 6 conservatives, so it doesn't look like they have the votes to prevail on this one.
We love to read a tea leaf as it relates to the Supreme Court here on the show. And one of the things that was interesting was that we can't as it relates to Justice Neil Gorsuch. Why is he important here? Because the conservative justice, as you know, back in 2020, he wrote the opinion on really the only other major case involving trans rights that the court has decided on, one that actually, in a kind of a surprise, upheld protections for gay and transgender workers.
Yeah, it was a little surprising that he didn't speak because he's not a justice who normally is shy of expressing himself.
We have no tea leaves we can read from him.
Yeah, but in the end, it might not matter, right? Because there's 3 liberal justices. Even if Justice Gorsuch did side with them, that only gets you to 4 votes, and there's 9 justices. You need 5.
To remind folks, too, this is not a decision that's going to be coming out tomorrow or the next day. We're looking at probably closer to the end of the court's term in June.
Yeah, and there's also a little intervening issue here, which is the Trump administration is going to be taking office. This case was brought by the Biden administration. It's quite possible the Trump administration is going to change its position in the case.
And what happens if they do?
Well, probably not much because there's also the individual plaintiffs in the case, but it'll still be significant that the Trump administration might say, actually, we don't think this is a constitutional issue at all.
Not to get into the weeds, but if that were to happen, would the court have to strike the arguments that they heard from the Solicitor General today?
No, it would just be that they would, the Trump administration would be basically saying they don't believe that anymore. the individual plaintiffs basically making the similar arguments, so it doesn't really make too much difference.
Still, an interesting thing to watch for. Lawrence
sure.
Shirley, plenty for you, I know, in the Supreme Court term. Thank you for being on with us. It's good to see you.